You're not on this flight, Trevor.
What are you talking about?
I had your booking canceled this morning. You're not coming to Lisbon.
That's not your decision to make.
It was. It is. And it's already done.
First class doesn't wait, Sabrina. You planned this.
You don't belong here anymore.
She tore my boarding pass in half at the gate and didn't flinch. She had canceled my booking, handed my seat in first class to the man she had been meeting privately for months, and decided that 13 years of building something together could simply be left at the departure gate. She walked away, certain she had won. What she didn't stop to ask herself not once on that entire flight to Lisbon was what a founding shareholder actually does when someone forges his signature to cut him out of a $480 million deal. If that question is already pulling at you, stay with this story because the answer changes everything. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time because what happens next is not what Sabrina planned for. I've been asked more than once what it feels like to watch someone tear apart something you spent years building. People assume the answer involves rage, some volcanic moment where everything breaks open and you stop being careful. But that's not how it happened for me. For me, it was quiet. It was a piece of paper sliding out of a torn envelope on a Tuesday afternoon, and the particular stillness that follows when you realize the person you trusted most has been planning your disappearance for months. 13 years ago, I met Sabrina at a small industry conference in Denver. She was 26, presenting a business plan to a room that wasn't really listening. I was listening. Not because the numbers were perfect, they weren't, but because she talked about hospitality the way I did, like it was a discipline, not just a service. She believed that how a hotel made someone feel in the first 60 seconds of walking through the door could change the entire texture of a person's trip. I had spent 6 years in hotel operations believing the exact same thing. After the conference ended, I found her by the coffee station and told her that her plan had 3 structural problems and 1 genuinely brilliant idea. She told me I was wrong about 2 of the 3. She was right. We were married 2 years later, and when the bank turned down her loan application for the first property, a mid-size boutique hotel in downtown Denver that had been sitting half-renovated for 3 years, I put in my own savings. Not as a gift, as a co-investor. We drew up a founding agreement together signed by both of us, with a clause requiring unanimous founding shareholder consent for any core asset transfer exceeding $50 million. At this time, it felt like standard responsible paperwork. Neither of us imagined we'd ever need to enforce it. Those first 2 years nearly broke us financially. There were months when payroll was a calculation I ran and reran at midnight looking for room that wasn't there. I restructured the operating model twice. I hired and trained the front-of-house team personally. When a pipe burst on the 3rd floor the week before opening and took out 2 guest rooms and part of the lobby ceiling, I spent 4 days managing contractors, negotiating with the insurance adjuster, and keeping Sabrina focused on the launch rather than the disaster. We opened on schedule. The reviews were strong. Crescent Arc hospitality was real. Over the next decade, it grew. A second property, a third. Investors started calling Sabrina instead of the other way around. She was a natural at the public side of the business. The presentations, the press, the forums where she walked into rooms and made people believe in whatever she was building next. I was better behind the scenes, and I didn't mind that. I built the systems that kept the properties running smoothly. I designed the document management protocols, the internal audit processes, the backup architecture for board-level communications. I took care of Miles when she traveled. I was the part of Crescent Arc that didn't have a title on the website, but without which the whole operation would have been considerably messier. The problem with being invisible by choice is that eventually people stop remembering you chose it. Year 8. Sabrina started telling the founding story differently. Not dramatically, just small omissions. The bank turning her down became a story about her persistence, not about the capital I secured. The near bankruptcy in year 2 became a story about her resilience, not about the restructuring I managed. I noticed it. I didn't make it a confrontation because I genuinely didn't think it mattered. The company was real. Miles was healthy and settled. I thought we were fine. Then, Bryce Langford arrived. He came in as a strategic consultant on the expansion into the mountain resort market Smart Presentable. Exactly the kind of person who moves through business environments like he has always been invited. Sabrina said he was the right person to help Crescent Arc reach the next level. Within 8 months, he had a full-time title as Chief Strategy Officer. The late calls started. The extended trips. A shift in how Sabrina occupied a room when he was present. A reorganization of her attention that I recognized not as professional excitement, but as something more personal and more consequential. I noticed. I kept functioning. 3 weeks before the Lisbon trip, a courier envelope arrived at the house instead of the Crescent Arc offices. It was addressed to Sabrina, marked confidential, and had been partially torn along the bottom seam during transit. I set it on the counter, intending to leave it untouched. But a single folded page had slipped out through the gap, and the header was visible before I even picked it up. Mariner Restructuring Agreement. I knew the name Mariner. It was the centerpiece of the biggest deal Crescent Arc had ever pursued, the acquisition of a Portuguese coastal resort portfolio that had been in negotiation for over a year. What I did not know was that a parallel document existed, one that had nothing to do with buying the resorts and everything to do with what happened to Crescent Arc's ownership structure after the deal closed. I read it at the kitchen table while Miles was at school. The restructuring plan called for the most valuable assets in the Crescent Arc portfolio to be transferred into a newly formed holding company before the acquisition finalized. The holding company had 2 named shareholders. Sabrina held controlling interest. Bryce Langford held 12%. My name was not in the ownership structure at all. What was in the document was a consent form stating that Trevor Maddox had voluntarily waived his right to object to the asset transfer. The signature at the bottom carried my name. I had never signed it. I had never seen this document before that afternoon. The signature was not mine. I sat with that for a long time. Not because I was uncertain about what I was looking at, but because I understood immediately what it meant and needed to be clear-headed about what I did next. The instinct was to call Sabrina directly to put the document on the table and demand an explanation. But if I did that, she and Bryce would know the envelope had arrived at the wrong address. Whatever else existed, other documents, the full paper trail of this plan could disappear before I had any of it. So I didn't call her. I put the page back in the envelope and spent the next hour thinking about Miles on the way to school that morning, asking if I was going to watch his soccer game on Thursday, completely unaware that the ground under our family was shifting. That evening, I contacted Monica Ellison, a commercial attorney I had worked with briefly years earlier on a vendor contract dispute, thorough, direct, and someone who didn't waste her client's time. I met her the following morning and put the envelope on her desk. She read it without interrupting herself, then asked me to give her 48 hours to review the original founding documents before we discussed next steps. What Monica found confirmed what I had suspected. The founding agreement from 13 years ago was still legally binding. Trevor Maddox was still a founding shareholder of Crescent Arc Hospitality. The consent clause had never been amended, never dissolved, never replaced by any subsequent agreement. Without my genuine signature on that form, the entire restructuring plan had no legal foundation, and without the restructuring, the acquisition could not proceed as Sabrina and Bryce had structured it. What they had built was not an aggressive business maneuver. It was fraud. Monica asked me one question before we discussed what to do next. She asked whether I wanted to save the marriage or protect what was legally mine. I looked at the consent form with my name on it, the name I had given to 13 years of work, to a company I had helped pull back from failure twice, to a backup system that was still quietly running on a server that nobody except me fully remembered existed. And I thought about Miles sitting in the front seat of my car, asking about a soccer game. I told Monica I wanted the truth. She told me we had 17 days before Sabrina was scheduled to close in Lisbon. 17 days to build a case strong enough to stop the deal without tipping off the people who had forged my name to make it happen. I drove home. I made dinner. When Sabrina came in at 7:30, I listened to her talk about her day, and she had no idea what was sitting in my jacket pocket. The clock had started. I wasn't going to waste a single day of it. Living with someone who is planning your removal is a particular kind of psychological endurance. You sit across from her at breakfast and she asks if you want more coffee and you say yes, and she pours it. And the whole time you are aware that somewhere on her phone or her laptop is a document carrying your forged name. You watch her kiss Miles on the top of his head before leaving for the office, and you think she is capable of this and also of that simultaneously without apparent contradiction. That was the part I hadn't fully understood about Sabrina until those 17 days. She didn't experience what she was doing as betrayal. She experienced it as strategy. I kept my behavior unchanged. I handled school pickup. I cooked on the nights she worked late, which was most nights. Monica had been clear with me from the beginning. The only advantage I had was that Sabrina and Bryce believed the envelope had never been opened, which meant they believed their timeline was intact and their plan was uncontested. The moment Sabrina sensed otherwise, that advantage was gone. So I held it carefully, like something breakable, for every one of those 17 days. Meanwhile, Sabrina was moving on a parallel track. It started subtly. My access to the Crescent Arc executive email system was narrowed, a forwarded chain. I expected to receive simply didn't arrive, and when I checked my permissions, several folders had been quietly reclassified. My name disappeared from the calendar invites for 2 board subcommittee meetings I had attended without interruption for 3 years. When I tried to log into the operational dashboard I had originally built, the credentials returned an access error. No explanation, no notification. Just a door that had been locked while I wasn't looking. A contact at one of the properties told me that Bryce had been talking to board members individually in the preceding weeks. His message, delivered casually, was that Trevor had naturally stepped back from active involvement in Crescent Arc over the years, that this was amicable and expected, and that the upcoming transaction represented a new chapter of leadership. He wasn't removing me publicly. He was constructing a version of history in which I had already left voluntarily, so that when the restructuring formalized what they had planned, there would be no visible rupture. Just a clean narrative. Trevor had stepped back. Crescent Arc had moved forward. One quiet conversation at a time, they were building the story that would make my erasure look like it had already happened. Monica's forensic accountant worked through the materials I provided and confirmed the full picture. The holding company had been incorporated 7 months earlier. After the acquisition closed, the most profitable properties would migrate into the new entity. Sabrina with controlling interest, Bryce holding 12%, while the debt-heavy remainder of Crescent Arc stayed behind in the original company. My stake would remain technically attached to that hollowed-out shell, still real on paper, worth almost nothing once everything of value had been transferred out. Monica put the summary in front of me and said this was not a divorce play. It was an asset-stripping plan with a divorce scheduled for afterward. She also told me more quietly that investigators had found hotel records from 4 separate trips over the past 18 months, showing Sabrina and Bryce sharing accommodation. I was quiet for a moment after she said that, not from surprise, but from the particular weight of having something confirmed in writing that you had only allowed yourself to half believe. Then I told Monica to set that information aside entirely. The signature was forged. The holding company was real. The intent was documented. Those were the facts that mattered in court, and I didn't want the case muddied by a personal element that Bryce's attorneys could use to reframe everything as a domestic dispute rather than a financial fraud. Monica agreed. She told me what she needed next was the source file digital metadata showing that the consent document had been modified after its creation, and by whom. That was the harder problem. The paper copy from the envelope was compelling but not sufficient for an emergency injunction. Without a digital forensic record showing the file had been altered, a court would be reluctant to freeze a transaction of this size on the eve of its closing. Monica said her team needed to find the original electronic version of the document and trace its version history. She told me she would work on it immediately and to give her everything I knew about how Crescent Arc's document systems were structured. I gave her something better than a description. I gave her the access credentials to the backup server I had built 8 years earlier when the company was migrating between platforms, and we had nearly lost 18 months of operational records due to a vendor failure. The secondary backup system I had designed ran automatically each night, creating version-stamped copies of every board-level document regardless of what happened on the primary platform. It lived on a separate server that had never been formally decommissioned because nobody at Crescent Arc had thought to decommission it, and the administrative credentials were still mine. I had simply never mentioned it to Bryce or to the current IT department. Monica passed the credentials directly to the forensic specialist on her team and told him to start immediately. It was around this time that Sabrina changed her approach to me at home. She came to me about a week before the scheduled closing and said she wanted me to come to Lisbon. She framed it as a gesture, a chance for us to be in the same place without the noise of Denver around us. She said the signing was a milestone and that she had been thinking about what things might look like if we approached it together. She was careful with her language. Not quite an apology, not quite a reconciliation, but something designed to feel like both. I sat across from her and listened, and thought she needs a photograph of me at that table. She needs someone who can testify later that I was present, informed, and apparently at ease with what was happening. My presence in Lisbon itself wouldn't establish legal consent, but being photographed at the pre-signing dinners, being visibly part of the social fabric of the deal, that was the kind of implied endorsement that could complicate a shareholder dispute significantly. Monica confirmed it when I called her the next morning. I told Sabrina I would think about it and gave her a non-answer she chose to interpret as a likely yes. Then 5 days before Lisbon, she stopped asking and simply told me she had booked the flights. We were leaving Thursday morning. I said fine. I didn't argue because arguing required explaining and I wasn't ready for that conversation. What I knew was that Monica's team was working through the backup server, that they were close, and that I had to keep Sabrina calm for a few more days. Thursday came. Monica called me early that morning with an update. Her forensic specialist had found the document in the backup archive and was working through the version history. He needed a few more hours to compile the full technical declaration the court would require. She told me that going to the airport posed no legal risk on its own. The danger was being seen at the signing events in Lisbon. She said, "Go see what she does and call me the moment anything changes." I drove to the airport with my bag and my boarding pass, and I already knew how it was likely to end. When I arrived at the gate, Bryce Langford was standing 20 feet from Sabrina, and the way they both looked at me when I walked up confirmed that they had not expected me to appear as composed as I did. Something shifted in Sabrina's expression, a recalibration, then a decision, and then she stepped forward and took the boarding pass from my hand. Not asked, took. She tore it in half in one clean motion and held the two pieces toward me as though returning something she had borrowed. She told me I didn't belong there anymore. Not in Lisbon, not in the deal, not in the company. Then she turned toward the gate and Bryce moved to her side, and within 2 minutes they were through the boarding door and gone. I stood at the gate, and my phone began to vibrate. The first notification, my Crescent Arc access credentials had been fully terminated. The second, a board resolution time-stamped 6 minutes earlier, declaring that Trevor Maddox had voluntarily withdrawn from all operational roles effective immediately. They had not waited for me to leave the building. Monica's call came 30 seconds after that. Her voice was steady. Her news was not. The emergency injunction request had been denied. The judge had found the paper evidence insufficient to freeze a transaction of this size without direct digital proof of the document modification. If Monica's team couldn't produce the metadata before the European markets opened, the following morning Sabrina would sign the closing documents in Lisbon, and the restructuring would activate and the window would close. The plane pushed back from the gate. Somewhere in the first-class cabin, the flight attendants were moving through the aisle with drinks, and Sabrina was settling into the seat that had been booked in my name, and Bryce Langford was 30,000 feet away from the consequences of what his account session had left behind in a backup archive on a server that nobody had remembered to decommission. I picked up my bag, walked toward the exit, and called Monica back. I told her I was coming to her. She told me to drive fast. Her forensic specialist had found the version history, and the picture was clearer than either of us had hoped. We had 6 hours and exactly the evidence we needed. I didn't buy another ticket. I want to be clear about that because I think people expect a certain kind of story. The wronged husband who follows his wife onto the next flight, who shows up in a foreign city and confronts her in some hotel lobby with the truth in hand. That image is satisfying. It is also exactly what Sabrina would have been prepared for, because it would have put me on her timeline reacting to what she had done instead of finishing what I had already started. So I drove directly to the meeting room Monica had reserved near the airport, walked in, and sat down across from her forensic specialist with 6 hours left before the European markets opened. His name was Grant. He had spent the better part of the day inside the backup archive I had given Monica access to the day before, and the picture he had assembled was cleaner than either of us had allowed ourselves to expect. The secondary server, the one I had built 8 years earlier and never told the current IT department existed, had preserved every version of every board-level document automatically, without interruption, without anyone at Crescent Arc knowing it was still running. What Grant had recovered was not just the document itself, but its entire history time-stamped and intact, going back to the moment of its creation. He walked us through it. The original consent form had been created 11 weeks earlier and saved to the board communications folder with my signature block empty. That version sat untouched for 9 days. Then it was accessed by an account registered to Bryce Langford's executive profile. The session lasted 22 minutes. When the document was saved and closed, my name had been populated in the signature field. 3 hours later, Sabrina's account opened the same file, reviewed it for 4 minutes, and marked it approved. The following morning, it was transmitted to the deal's lead attorney in London as a complete and executed consent document. The metadata didn't suggest fraud. It proved it step by step in a sequence that left no reasonable alternative interpretation. Monica had the full forensic package transmitted to the court before 2 a.m. Denver time. The judge reviewing emergency motions that night was presented with version-stamped file records, account access logs, and Grant's technical declaration explaining precisely what the data showed. At 3:47 in the morning, the Colorado court issued a temporary restraining order, freezing all asset transfers and closing activities associated with the Mariner Coast acquisition pending a full hearing. Monica read me the order number over the phone. I was still in the meeting room sitting with a cup of coffee I had stopped tasting an hour earlier. She told me the court had also notified Wexler Capital's legal team as a named financial counterparty. I asked what Diane Wexler would do with that notification. Monica said Diane Wexler had been waiting for it since their first conversation. The rest would happen in Lisbon. The flight from Denver lands in Lisbon in the early afternoon local time. Sabrina and Bryce would have transferred directly to the hotel where the signing was scheduled, walked through the lobby with the ease of people who believe a transaction is already finished, and entered the conference room expecting to sit down with documents and a room arranged for celebration. Instead, they found Diane Wexler, a closed laptop and a screen connected to a video feed from Denver. I was on that feed. I had not slept. I was in the same room I had occupied for the past several hours, in the same clothes I had worn to the airport, and I watched through the camera as Sabrina came through the door and understood in the space of a single second that something had gone profoundly wrong. She looked at the screen the way someone looks at a thing they were certain they had already put away safely. There was no composure left to manage. She went very still. Diane Wexler set a printed copy of the court order on the table and said that the Colorado court had issued a temporary restraining order effective immediately, and that Wexler Capital was suspending its participation in the closing until the underlying questions about shareholder consent had been resolved through proper legal process. She said this quietly, the way someone speaks when the decision is already made and there is nothing left to negotiate. Then Monica took over the video feed and walked the room through the forensic record Bryce's account session. The 22 minutes, the signature that appeared where no signature had existed. Sabrina's approval 3 hours later, and the transmission to London the following morning. Bryce started talking before Monica finished. He said he had been following direction. He said the restructuring framework had come from Sabrina's legal team and that his access to the document had been part of a routine administrative review. He said he had not understood that the consent documentation was incomplete. He said a great many things in rapid succession, and most of them directly contradicted positions he had held for the previous 7 months, and none of them held up against the timestamp on his own account session. Sabrina heard every word. She was still near the door, and she watched Bryce work through his deflections with the focused attention of someone cataloging information they would need later. I could see on the feed, even through the distance, even through the screen, the exact moment she understood what she had traded him for. Diane Wexler terminated the meeting 20 minutes after it began. Wexler Capital formally withdrew from the transaction that afternoon. The three banking institutions that had co-arranged the acquisition financing followed within hours once the restraining order became public record. The Mariner Coast deal died on the day it was scheduled to close in the city Sabrina had flown to, believing she had already won. What followed was procedural and exhausting. Crescent Arc's board opened an independent investigation. Sabrina was placed on administrative leave. Bryce's access to all company systems was terminated immediately, and the forensic evidence was referred to the relevant authorities. He retained an attorney within 48 hours and spent the following months attempting to separate himself from Sabrina's decisions as cleanly as he could, which was not very cleanly at all, given that his account credentials were the ones attached to a 22-minute document modification session. The interim board asked whether I would be willing to support their transition period, not to reassume an operational role, but to make myself available, given my knowledge of how the company's systems actually functioned. I agreed to 90 days, not out of loyalty to Sabrina and not because I thought I owed the company anything after what had been done. I agreed because the people working inside Crescent Arc had built their careers in good faith and had nothing to do with what happened in the executive layer, and they deserved to have someone in the room who understood how the infrastructure worked while the company found its footing. Miles had asked me once why I cared so much about making sure things ran correctly, even when nobody was watching. I had told him that the people inside a system don't stop being real just because the people at the top aren't paying attention to them. That was still true. Sabrina contacted me 4 times in the months after Lisbon. Twice by text, once through a mutual acquaintance and once through her attorney with a request to meet privately and informally. I declined each time. There was nothing in a private conversation that couldn't be handled through our respective lawyers, and I had no interest in giving her the opportunity to reframe what had happened in terms more comfortable for her. The divorce proceedings began 31 days after the court order. I let Monica handle the details. What I noticed during those months, and I noticed it without satisfaction, without the particular pleasure that people assume comes with being right, was that the thing I had feared most had not happened. The truth had become public. The company had not collapsed. The employees still had jobs, and the version of history that Bryce had been distributing to board members one quiet conversation at a time had been replaced by the documentary record. I had not destroyed Crescent Arc. I had prevented someone from hollowing it out. Those are not the same thing, and it mattered to me that they remained distinct. I drove home from the meeting room at 5 in the morning, the day after the airport, let myself in quietly, and went to check on Miles. He was asleep. I stood in the doorway and looked at the shape of him in the dark, and thought about the version of the past 13 years that Sabrina and Bryce had been building, the version in which I had stepped back voluntarily, in which my contributions were minor and easily set aside, in which the company's success belonged entirely to one person's vision. That version required a forged signature to function. It couldn't hold without one because the real history was more stubborn than they had planned for. The real history had my name on it in ways that didn't require anyone's approval to exist. I no longer had any operational connection to Crescent Arc. After the 90-day transition period ended, I sold the majority of my founding stake at its properly assessed value, a number considerably higher than what it would have been worth in the hollowed-out shell Sabrina had planned to leave behind, and retained a small residual position as a matter of record. With the proceeds, I started a consultancy. Small, deliberately so. Hotels and financial distress operators who had made structural errors. They didn't fully understand, yet owners who needed someone to walk through their systems and tell them honestly what was salvageable and what wasn't. I was good at it. I had been doing versions of it for 13 years without a title. The office was a converted ground floor space in central Denver with large windows that caught the afternoon light. Miles did his homework there sometimes after school, sitting at the table near the window with his backpack open and his headphones on, content to occupy a room quietly while I worked. On the shelf near the window there was a small glass frame. Inside it, mounted on a plain white background, were two pieces of torn paper, a boarding pass split cleanly down the middle with my name printed across both halves. Miles asked about it once, the way an 11-year-old asks about things directly without preamble because he saw no reason not to. I told him I kept it because sometimes being left behind is how you finally find out where you belong. I thought about that for a moment, then went back to his homework. Outside, Denver was moving into evening, the city lights coming on in layers across the skyline. No Sabrina, no Bryce, no audience left to perform a victory for. Just the work, the window, and the quiet that finally felt like mine. There's something I want to leave you with before you go. Trevor didn't win because he was angrier or louder or more ruthless than Sabrina. He won because when everything was taken from him, his ticket, his access, his name on a document he never signed, he didn't let rage make the decisions. He used patience. He used the truth. And he used something Sabrina had forgotten, that the systems he built quietly for years without needing credit were still running. The work you do with integrity doesn't disappear just because someone else stops acknowledging it. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe if you haven't already, because there are more stories like this one coming, and every single one of them is worth your time.